In anticipation for The Force Awakens, the popularity of Star Wars is at an all-time high, and part of that discussion revolves around the possibility that Episode 7 will not just be the first Star Wars film in 10 years, but the first good one since 1983. Most of this discussion is coming from the OG fanboys, the 30 to 40 somethings who were kids when the original trilogy was being released and remember a time when it was just those 3 films and nothing else. What I'm not seeing as much is talk amongst the slightly younger fan base, the now 20-somethings whose main childhood exposure to the galaxy far, far away wasn't full of Death Stars and AT-ATs, but midichlorians and Gungans. The Star Wars fan who grew up amongst the prequels, and through them were introduced to one of the most enduring franchises in pop culture history. I am one of those fans, and I want to talk about not why the prequels are good, because they're not, but why their existence is not the complete blight on the franchise those older fans constantly want to make it out to be. I was born in the early 1990s, and my exposure to Star Wars during my early childhood was minimal. I grew up abroad for most of that time, and my parents were around my age now when the originals came out, so it wasn't quite a big deal to them. I was certainly aware of them and had some vague memories of maybe seeing Return of the Jedi on VHS at a friend's house, but for me, my first true exposure to Star Wars came in 1999. My mother took me and my sister to see it, and for the first time I witnessed Star Wars on the big screen and I was immediately hooked. But only in the same way I was obsessed with things like Digimon and Power Rangers at the time. Sure, I remember buying things like R2-D2 Bubble Bath, a Darth Maul lightsaber toy, sticker books, action figures, all that good stuff. But on reflection, seeing The Phantom Menace was as much a life-altering experience as seeing Pokemon the first movie. The same happened when Attack of the Clones came out a few years later, but to even less impact. I remember coming out of the cinema raving about the Yoda vs. Dooku fight, but at that point Spider-Man was my main obsession, and I never even saw Episode 2 again until years later. Star Wars was a part of my life, but I certainly wouldn't have considered myself a fan at the time. That all changed in 2004, when I got the DVD set of the original trilogy. You see, at that point my exposure to episodes 4, 5, and 6 was minimal because my parents were waiting for this set to come out. Beforehand, you could still only get the originals on VHS, and what I had seen at that point was just brief bits and pieces from when they'd play on TV. To be honest, my main exposure to those films at that point was the Monopoly Star Wars computer game that came with one of my dad's laptops back in the late 90s. But now with these DVDs, I finally got to sit down and watch the original films in order for the first time. And that was the experience that finally converted me into a Star Wars fanboy. I watched those films over and over, along with the hours of special features. My childhood sketchbooks became filled with nothing but lightsabers and stormtroopers. Battlefront became the #1 game I had to get for my PlayStation 2 that Christmas. And my anticipation for Episode 3 went from mild interest to restless excitement. To this day, I love Star Wars. I have a Return of the Jedi poster hanging by my bed, I have a Darth Vader action figure sitting on my bookshelf, and a good majority of my t-shirt collection consists of things like a surfing Chewbacca or Boba Fett with a boombox. I love Star Wars. So what's the point of this story, you ask? What does my exposure to Star Wars say about the franchise as a whole? Well, I think an important note of it is, if the Star Wars prequels were these terrible films that ruined the whole saga, why hasn't it stopped the fan base from growing? A few years ago, I went back and watched the prequels from an adult perspective, and yes, they have a lot of problems that I recognized then, and recognize even more now as a savvy film fan. But within them is the germ of something good. Ideas and concepts that have potential, or perhaps even work within those films for a bit. And I think whether kids my age recognize them or not, that's what kept us interested in those stories. It wasn't a totally hollow experience like many of our other childhood fixations. Marketing and merchandise were certainly a part of it, but they weren't outright toy commercials. They maybe weren't the groundbreaking pieces of cinema their predecessors were, but they were good enough in our eyes to hold our attention and, more importantly, make us want to know more. If the prequels were truly bad films, my interest in seeing the originals probably wouldn't have been so strong. Other than a few jarring continuity flubs between the trilogies and the obvious modern changes made to the originals, I was able to enjoy the classic Star Wars saga much the same way any kid would have in a pre-Jar Jar age. My appreciation of the prequels may have deteriorated as I've gotten older, but without them, I wouldn't have large parts of my childhood. I wouldn't have memories of running around the house with my Darth Maul lightsaber reenacting the end of Phantom Menace. I wouldn't have played video games like Episode 1 Racer, Jedi Power Battles, or the original LEGO Star Wars. I wouldn't have the awesome Jendy Tartakovsky Clone Wars animated series. Even today their impact is still felt. There's the newer Clone Wars CG animated show, which has led into the excellent Rebels series, and merchandise from the prequel films are still part of even the new wave just released in time for Episode 7. Every day, kids are becoming Star Wars fans, and a good majority of them are probably being introduced to the property through means other than A New Hope. But like me, that doesn't mean they won't get attached to those original films eventually. It all comes back to what makes Star Wars so wonderful and enduring. It's timeless. Sure, Star Wars' popularity back in 1977 was tied into the world events of the time, but the core elements of its storytelling and philosophy are relevant whether you were alive at the time or were born only a few years ago. The only other franchise that can compete in terms of longevity and social relevance is The Lord of the Rings, and even then that only hit peak popularity at the turn of the 21st century. Like the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, the superhero universes of Marvel and DC, and the mythological pantheons of the Greek and the Norse, Star Wars is deeply rooted in the popular conscience and will remain there until our culture no longer exists. In the grand scheme of things, does it really matter if parts of it aren't perfect? Did everything Tolkien write work? Has everything Stan Lee ever created become popular? Not to be morbid, but just think about this. There will come a time I will probably live to see, where no one who saw the original Star Wars films when they were released will be alive. Will the fandom die with them? Is Mace Windu's lightsaber purple? The Star Wars prequels have done very little to harm the franchise as a whole. Any damage caused or fans lost have been more than regained in the years since, and that's mainly because those original films are so good and so cherished that almost nothing could truly destroy them. Could the prequels have been better? Of course. Should George Lucas constantly be demonized and treated like some sort of criminal? Fuck no. Ultimately, the point I want to make is this. I'm not excited for The Force Awakens just because it has the original cast or practical effects or because Lucas has very little to do with it. I'm excited because it's a fucking Star Wars movie. The fact it'll probably be better than 2 hours of Hayden Christensen moaning against a green screen is far from the top reason I want to see it. So, older Star Wars fan who may be watching this, the next time you want to moan about how George Lucas ruined your childhood, just remember there are generations of young adults and children who have grown up with The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith who love Star Wars just as much as you do. And before you claim that those people and I are just blinded by nostalgia, don't get cocky, kid. I could easily say you are just as blind as me. Don't give in to your fear because, as an elderly green elf puppet once said,
fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
Couldn't have said it better myself.